Welcome to the Business Series podcast. My name is Ankush Jain, and I am a state of mind coach working with businesses and individuals. On each episode of this series, I'll be speaking to a coach or trainer on a different topic relevant to your career or personal development. Enjoy. Welcome to another episode of the Business Series podcast. Today I'm joined by Barbara Patterson, who is the owner of a global coaching and consulting company, bringing the insights of performance and fulfillment to clients around the world. She helps organizations, leaders, entrepreneurs and coaches access more clarity, creativity, have greater impact and higher levels of performance in work and in life. Welcome, Barb.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me, Ankush.
Well, I'm really excited to have you with us today. And today, the title we have is How to Give Effective Feedback and Receive It. So I think it's a very practical, juicy topic for us to talk about with regards to feedback. So I want to just jump straight in and ask you what is effective feedback and why is this not more common? Why do we even need to talk about this?
Yeah, well, I think in a simple way, I would say effective feedback is feedback that is clear and lands and has impact, that people are able to hear it and take it and run with it in a way. And Ankush, I know you know this, but I've spent my whole career in kind of the organizational development, leadership development. So performance reviews, giving feedback, effective feedback is always on the minds in businesses and with leadership. So I understand it well. And then since coming across kind of the understanding of the role that our minds are playing moment to moment in our communication and our ability to have impact, I've seen something really new and different around it.
And before we get into what that is, why is it not more common, therefore, for people to give feedback, like you say, in regular one-to-ones, in year-end reviews, or when a manager or a leader is not happy with an employee's performance? Why is it not effective, or is it? Are we just making this up? But if not, why not?
Well, I think we have some bad habits, or we overthink it to, again, keep it simple. So I think all leaders genuinely want to do right by their people, and they want to be helpful. And I think a lot of leaders worry about the feedback having an adverse effect, that it will actually do more damage than help. I think that's one of it. The other is I think they feel a little bit worried about their own ability to deliver it in an effective way. And then thirdly, I think we wait too long. And then there's more emotional byproduct as a result of that. And so it creates more tension in the exchange.
So if a leader is listening to this and they're thinking, I might have some or all of those things going on for me, worried about what the person, might take it in the wrong way, what they might think of me, I might be putting it off. So let's say I'm in one or all of those things, or maybe something else that we haven't discussed. How do I give effective feedback and have it be received well with the intended consequences?
Yeah, well, I think if you understand, the first place you need to look is where the quality of your own mind is in that moment. And it's pretty easy to see. Are you sped up, rushed, impatient, judgmental, upset, frustrated, nervous? Your feeling will be your first kind of gauge of where you're coming from. As soon as we see it and we respect a more neutral mind will naturally start to move in that direction. And it is surprisingly effective and amazing what you can say when you come from a more neutral space inside of you.
Someone might be listening to this and not understand what you mean by that or how to get there. So if I'm a leader listening to this and I'm kind of in my head and kind of maybe nervous or annoyed, giving feedback, how do I orientate myself to a place of neutrality? Because that sounds great. If I don't have a lot on it, it makes sense that I could be more effective. But how do I orientate myself to that?
Well, I think this is kind of the place to develop inside of you. The first place, and it may sound too simple, but you really have to respect the idea that if you come from a more free mind, a more present, more neutral place, that you're going to be way more effective and the person's going to be able to hear you. If you buy that, right, then you will naturally do what it takes, what's required in the moment to get there. And sometimes it's waiting. But what happens is we go in and out of reactivity and neutrality all day long. That's just kind of the natural makeup of the way we are. No reaction is permanent. So I know every single person listening can think of a time when they were reactive and they held back, they waited. So if you do that, you can trust that your mind will settle, you'll get to a place of neutrality, and you'll have the conversation. That's one thing. But the other thing I want to say is, if you see your reactivity, you're already ahead of the game. And often you can start a conversation just being honest. Like, hey, I'm a little upset. Let's just get beyond that. Let's have a conversation. I want to have a conversation with you here. So in a way, you're putting it out there, but it's not front and center. It's not ruling the conversation anymore. So it's not like you have to wait to be in this perfect state. You've just got to see and respect more that your goal is to come from a meeting of the minds, a more neutral place, and to be more effective in your communication.
I really like that. So I guess the image I've got in my head is if I've got to give feedback to an employee and I walk in the office and I spill my coffee all over my papers and I've just got this email in where something's not quite going right and I'm all frazzled, that's not the most appropriate time to then give feedback that might be a difficult piece of feedback to give. It's about, okay, doing it in the right place. And it sounds almost similar to virtually every single relationship that we have. If we're going to have any kind of difficult conversation, it makes sense to have that when we're in as better place as we can, as best a place we can be mentally. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think some of the most profound, transformative conversations have been feedback I've gotten from people. And it wasn't fun to hear, right? But because they saw it and then they took the time to point it out to me, it was transformative. And so I think the other thing I just want to say is, we all might, get a little reactive and not love that we're getting it. But ultimately, when feedback is given with the intent to serve, to redirect, to help out, to, right a situation, people get there. You start to have, more faith in that people will find their way. And if you as the giver can make it okay that initially people may bristle a little bit, it's much easier as well. You don't take that personally and you see like, oh, they'll get over their reaction because we're pointing to something that's ultimately helpful and needed.
And that's a beautiful segue because I wanted to ask you about receiving it as well as giving it. So let's say I'm receiving feedback and maybe it looks like to me that the other person doesn't have my best interests at heart. Maybe I'm getting feedback and the other person is frazzled or upset. How can I be open to feedback, or as open as I can be? Is what you're saying, does that have a role in that too?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I was working with this global hotel company and we were talking about giving feedback. And to your very point, they very quickly said, well, let's do some modules on receiving it as well, because that's just as important. And it's very similar, as you probably already know. But when I'm getting feedback, I can get a sense of my own reactivity. Like I said, we don't love it. We don't always want to, we just have an emotional reactive response, maybe initially, not always. But that part then is the receiver. If I don't respect the reactivity, I again just keep oriented towards trying to understand what's being said, trying to understand the feedback. That'll help me find my way also. And like we said before, all reactions pass. So in a way, the reaction becomes less interesting, and we get more interested in trying to understand what's being said.
So in my head, I have an image of a child, and if a child is getting really, really upset, we find it perhaps easier with children to look past the reactivity and listen to, okay, you're hungry, you're tired, and not take that personally. That's the kind of image I'm getting. Is that what you're pointing to, of listening to the essence of what the person is saying without any of that extraneous emotion that might go along with it?
Yeah, I can give you a personal example. I was a number of years ago, I was being offered two different positions within the same company. And both the people I would work for, I really respected and liked. Now, when I finally made my decision, the one that I turned down got very upset with me. And it wasn't pretty. His reaction was very intense, and he kind of, went after me. And I got really upset. Now, because, I kind of just had to go on about my day, I had other work to do. And as I said, all reactions passed. As it passed, I started to feel more compassion for him and understand, like, oh, I disappointed him. And that's all that was. And then I saw, as I kind of got clearer, I said, oh, and in a way, I kind of led him on. Because I always knew I knew I would take the other one. That's where I was leaning. But because I wasn't 100% sure, because I didn't want to disappoint him, I, was definitely very engaged in the idea that I might take that role. So I could see in that moment of clarity, oh, of course he's disappointed. Of course it looked like to him like I was going to pick that role. And so the reason I tell that story is by just allowing the reactivity to pass. As my mind cleared, I saw with more perspective, and I was able to take accountability for my part in that exchange. And as a result, I was able to go back and kind of repair and have a really good conversation and, kind of get things back on solid footing with him.
And do you have any case studies to bring this to life around where you might have worked with a client around specifically this topic? I know you mentioned earlier about working with an organization around giving and receiving feedback, and just any examples of what it was like before and then after you maybe worked with them on what we're talking about today.
Yeah, I can give a specific example. I worked with a leader who really wanted his team to step up more. He was very frustrated. He felt like they weren't being innovative enough. To him, it started to look like they maybe were bad hires or they weren't smart enough. He had a lot of upset about them. And as we began to work together, I could see that all of his feedback and his reaction came with this upset, this kind of anger and this edge. And when we talked about it, he kind of believed that, oh yeah, no, you gotta scare people a little bit to make them more effective. He kind of came from that old school of thinking. But what began to happen is he started to see how anytime he was more tense, he didn't perform as well. Anytime he was upset, his thinking got more contaminated. So he started to see, oh, wait, if I'm upset, I don't do as well. Well, that must be true for them. So he started to see that the way he was communicating was actually creating an environment of tension and reactivity. And here he was wanting people to step up more. But if they stepped up and didn't do it exactly the way he thought, he was explosive. So you could see to them, all of a sudden, it wasn't quite worth it. They were trying to, what we discovered was, they were spending an immense amount of mental energy trying to please him, which isn't what he wanted. He wanted thinkers. He wanted people on their feet, but he didn't see what he was doing to create an environment where that was almost impossible. So once he started to respect, oh yeah, if they're upset, if they're tense, if they're worried about me blowing up, if they're, feel like I'm going to come after them, they aren't going to do as well. So he started to naturally work on it. It wasn't perfect here. It was, over a period of time. But he started to see the value of more neutrality as a result over a period of time. It was amazing. He said to me at one time, I remember talking, he's like, oh yeah, he said, man, I don't know what happened, but people are really stepping up. They're really performing. I'm really pleased with what they're doing. And then when we debriefed it and talked about it a little more, that's what happens. That's a natural output. When people come to things with a freer mind and less reactivity, less constriction, they access new levels of innovation and creativity and confidence and intelligence.
It sounds very, very straightforward. Is it so straightforward? Is it so simple?
Yeah. You know what? It is. I know, right? And believe me, I've spent my whole career doing a lot of different training for the 5-step model on how to give feedback. And yet when I began to see that the real leverage for good conversation, for good feedback is the quality of where you're coming from in that moment, that's the most leveraged thing you have going for you, it became a very simple conversation, a very different one, less about, the 5-step model for feedback and more about people being able to hold themselves accountable and respecting that this idea that if they come in a more neutral, freer mind, they're going to do better. And so will the people around them.
Wonderful. And just to wrap up today, what's the one takeaway you want our listeners to leave this podcast with?
Well, I think it's a couple things. Is if you make feedback a thing, like I think we just turn it into something bigger than it needs to be. If you can see that you want to be in real time with your team members, your employees, your vendors, whoever it is you want to give feedback to, that in your ability to just be in real time, give feedback, respond in the moment, you're not going to build up a lot of feedback that you need to find a way to give. So I'd say just get comfortable sharing as you go along. And to remember that in a neutral mind, you can say anything and you can really have really tough conversations, give really tough feedback. But if you're in a neutral place, it can be heard and can be transformative for people.
And if people would love to connect with you, find out more, maybe hire you, what's the best way that they can do that?
I think the best way is you can find out more about me at barbarapatterson.com, or you can email me directly at barb@barbarapatterson.com.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, and I will be back very soon with another episode relevant to business. Thanks, Barb.
Thanks, Ankush.
Thanks for listening to the Business Series podcast. If you want to hear more, you can click on the subscribe button below. You can share this with someone else who can benefit, or you can like it and encourage others to listen. Also, it would be great if you left a comment below, as I love hearing from listeners and I want to keep creating great content for you. Thanks for listening.